G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with what is indubitably a malt liquor video. My local bottle shop has recommenced selling Dundee Pale India Ale, 6.3% alcohol per volume, 1.8 standard drinks each. Okay, so this is a malt liquor video. It's American beer, which is over 5% alcohol per volume. There's number 3, and here is the credit card sized stainless steel tool, which lives in my wallet, so that I am able to open bottles which are not twist tops. If you look really carefully, you can see the dents made in the lid by the shallow ellipse on the tool for opening beer bottles. So, label out the malt liquor video. Okay, so let's start the movie by going for a bit of a walk, eh? It's, what's the time? 20 past 6, Eastern Daylight Saving Time, so it's actually 20 past 5. Therefore, thus and because, the sun has not actually gone down yet. Such is daylight plastic fucking about with time principles. And I'm the sort of person who lives by standalone solar power, so I don't really have much truck with such ideas. Anyway, the topic of this movie, my YouTube followers and occasional incidental viewers, is anti-natalism. Why argue against it? Okay? Why would anybody want to argue against anti-natalism? Well, I'm going to assume that some of the people who watch this video have never heard of anti-natalism. Some of them may even have thought I was thinking of anti-natalism. Anti, A-N-T-E, is a prefix that means before. Antenatal classes, N-A-T-A-L, means before birth. No, not a bit of it. This movie is about why would anybody want to argue against anti-natalism. Anti-natalism is against birth. Anti-natalism is, well, it's a kind of a self-styled political movement. It's a wannabe political movement. It's a self-styled philosophy, a wannabe philosophy. To people who are not adherents, then anti-natalism, the philosophy of being against birth, appears to be more of a philosophy. Right? A thinking foolishness. Now, this philosophy of anti-natalism, or philosophy, depending on your point of view, it got its start with a fairly rampant woman-hater by the name of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer lived hundreds of years ago and he thought women were not fully human. He also thought that life wasn't worth living. So Schopenhauer, the misogynist, he's kind of like the founding prophet of anti-natalism, the anti-birth movement. We're not talking zero population growth, we're talking zero population. These people reckon that, well, as their 20th century prophet and hero David Benatar said in his book Better Never to Have Been, he said, life is suffering. He claimed that suffering is bad, absence of suffering is good. And the anti-natalists accept that without question. It does not occur to the anti-natalists that suffering does not exist as an entity. Suffering is a matter of signal processing. What to one person is absolutely unbearable conditions, to somebody else may well be undreamt of luxury. Yeah. It's just how it goes, you know. Suffering is what you're used to. Suffering is signal processing. When an amoeba swims away from acid, following a gradient of fresh water that doesn't burn, that's not suffering. It's like a sucking chest wound, you know, a hemopneumothorax. It's not suffering, it's nature's way of telling you to slow down. Yeah, suffering. But anyway, Benatar, David Benatar, the Benatard, he says, suffering is bad, absence of suffering is good. He says, if you can prevent the suffering of a non-existent being by preventing that being's conception, that must be good. Because, or however, or apropos of nothing else, he also says, if you prevent the non-existent being from ever perceiving happiness or joy or pleasure, or even the ennui of an otherwise boring Sunday afternoon, that is not bad. So Benatar prioritises suffering over everything else. And Benatar and Schopenhauer have been kind of plucked from obscurity and fanned into the flames of a extremely obscure movement on YouTube by a few individuals. Pretty much the patron saint is a character who's a lot like me, you know, like I'm 52, well 52 next birthday, happens, you know, in a couple of months. This guy just turned 53. Gary is his name, Adin Mendham is his channel. He lives in a town called Mendham, New Jersey. Gary Adin Mendham. Not difficult to work out. He really hates people telling his name, his actual personal name on YouTube, so I won't piss him off by saying it. But he's got over 2,000 videos, something like 8,000, 8,500 subscribers, and he's kind of like the patron saint of anti-natalism. He's taken it a step further. He's invented a movement he calls EFIL-ism. Capital E, capital F, capital I, capital L, capital E, EFIL. Life, backwards, EFIL-ism. Now, life backwardsism has as its goal the idea of extinguishing life in the universe, because Gary assumes that planet Earth is the only planet in the whole of the night sky where there's life in the zone between water freezing and water boiling. It's a wild assumption, but it pleases Gary, the inventor of life backwardsism and the patron saint of the anti-natalists. Now, my question is, why argue against anti-natalism? And it's this. Technically, anti-natalism's prime directive, to wit, life is not worth living, is ipso facto per se evidence, well, it's ipso facto per se, it is suicidal ideation. If you say, and I'm going to show you something here, if you say life is not worth living, you are suffering, or you are entertaining, you are having suicidal ideation. That is a ground orchid. You can eat the root. There is my boundary fence. On the other side is sheep farmer land. They have no ground orchids. There's another one. There's another one. Okay. There is another one. Now, do you see why I pay the rates for the privilege of using trespassing sheep for archery practice. It is the trespassing sheep which eat the human food plants. It was the trespassing sheep which made the free-range Aborigines extinct hereabouts. So, why am I against anti-natalism? Well, why do I argue against anti-natalism? It's suicidal ideation. Now here in Australia, our suicide rate runs at 5 times the road toll. Taking some wild extrapolations, I know the New South Wales road toll is about 500 a year. It used to be 1,200, maybe even 1,700. But 500 a year, 5 times that, 2,500. New South Wales is the most populous state in Australia. Let's say we're talking call it 22,000, maybe 25,000 Australians are suiciding every year, right? 5 times the 5,000 who are killing themselves on the roads. That's pretty sad, but there are 22 million Australians. Now, Gary, the patron saint of anti-natalism, recently on a movie that was put up by a fella called Quantica, Quntkkka, who was taking the piss out of Gary, and he was rebroadcasting bits of Gary, and there was Gary suggesting that 10 or 20% of the people in the world agree with his proposition, or they would if they knew that he existed. If they listened to him, then they would agree with him. 10 to 20%. If you go to my video scroll and go back a week or so, you'll find a movie called Wallaby Studies, The Psychology of bracket, Global Warming close bracket, Denialism. Right? It's a New Scientist magazine article that I read to a swamp wallaby. In there, it points out that global warming denialists currently make up 5% of the population at large. But they personally believe that they are in agreement with 50% of the population at large. All right? They 10 times overestimate their social standing. Now, I call that, the delusions of adequacy bullshit detector factor. And I say that if Gary ad Inmendum says that he's got 10 or 20% of the population who agree with him, I say he's got a tenth of that. I say 1.5% of the population might actually be so bloody miserably depressed that they think life is not worth living. 1.5% of the 22 million people in Australia is 350,000. At the moment, only 25,000 are killing themselves every year. How many susceptible, vulnerable individuals do you have to piss in their ear hole and tell them that life is not worth living before somebody who's pissed off because they split their toenail and, the sky's just not quite the right colour polka dots? How long before one of them decides, oh, I hate my life. It's not turning out the way I thought it would when I was a toddler watching television and imagining the world. Therefore, I'll go on the internet and I'll discover Gary preaching the unworthiness of life and how, in order to prevent suffering, everything has to be killed. Snuff out all sentience. Thus and because, I'll just hang myself. How many people does Gary have to talk to before he convinces somebody to kill themselves? How many people do the anti-natalists have to preach their philosophy regarding the alleged futility of life into the ear holes of? How many people have they got to talk to before somebody kills himself? I have seen a YouTube suicide note addressed to Gary, typed so badly that you could barely read it. almost incoherent. Oh, Gary, you're right. Oh, life isn't worth living. I'm going to have to kill myself. And then a couple of days of silence. And that individual posted the next movie from the home for the bewildered, where they were taken to when they were found suicidally dosed with whatever it was that they had eaten. Pharmaceutical drugs. How many people is Gary going to grandstand to before he kills someone? By talking them into suicide. There you go. Why is anti-natalism worth arguing against? Because I think suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and it should be disputed and debated at every possible opportunity. Unless you're in absolutely unbearable pain, I don't see why you want to kill yourself. And if you haven't got some kind of major organic disease, I think you can probably work through whatever emotional problem or memory or abuse or trauma or terror it is that causes you to think that life is not worth living. My personal experience is that life is a good choice. Okay, but I am the fool on the hill. Alright? I am the hillbilly hermit. I used to live at Swallowshit Hollow, now I live at South Dundee Heights. I pay the rates on an endangered species sanctuary so that I can use trespassing sheep for archery practice. And this has been a malt liquor video. Why argue against anti-natalism? Because it's a fucking mad idea, and mad ideas should be disputed. It's only a matter of life and death. Therefore it's worth spending a little bit of my lifetime to dispute it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Label out.